Okay, now we're going to focus on all the dynamics with blood circulation. So, talking about three big concepts: flow, resistance, and pressure, and the relationship between those, and how if you manipulate one of them, it will influence the others, and how those change throughout the body. So, ultimately, your body has many control mechanisms to regulate blood flow and pressure in order to keep functioning. And again, it's by manipulating one variable, you can influence the outcome of another variable. And there's two types of blood flow throughout the body. You have what's called laminar flow and what's called turbulent flow. Think of laminar flow as sort of a smooth stream with no rocks. All of the water or fluid is going in one direction. It's all very streamlined. And in this case, you have the outermost layer, or the outside of the stream, moving more slowly than the center. The center is always moving the fastest. And then with turbulent flow, with this stream analogy, think of it like a really rocky stream. It's very interrupted. You're having a lot of eddying and mixing of the water, and it's a lot more rough. So this happens when your blood, which is the fluid in this case, passes some sort of blood constriction or blood vessel constriction, some sort of turn or rough surface within the blood vessel, etc. Some of this is normal. Some of this in the heart, such as in the ascending aorta and descending aorta, this occurs, as well as the branching of the arteries. But in terms of the main portions of arteries, we should not be seeing turbulent flow. We want to have that nice laminar flow. And to show you a diagram of what this looks like, on the left we have laminar flow with the fluid on the outside moving slowest and the fluid on the inside moving quickest. You see there's no interruptions, it's just headed straight for its destination. Then on the right, we have our turbulent flow, where we have some sort of constriction, and this creates, again, a sort of roughy, rockier stream, and it's causing a lot of eddying, the blood's mixing in on itself, it's all moving at different rates. Not the blood flow we really want. And this concept of blood flow ties into blood pressure being the actual force that the blood cells themselves are exerting on the wall or whatever blood vessel we're looking at. There's two ways to measure this. We have a direct way and an indirect way. The direct way is using a device called a cannula, which is basically this needle that gets injected into the blood vessel and can stimulate it to vasoconstrict or vasodilate. And from that, they can measure the pressure in each of those phases. This is a lot more invasive, and most times we opt for the indirect method, which is called the oscillatory method. And we use a device called a sphygmomanometer. It's a very long word for a blood pressure cuff, which I'm sure many of you have seen in a doctor's office if you've ever had your blood pressure during your physical or just for a routine checkup. What they do using this sphygmomanometer and a stethoscope is they're looking for what are called Korsakoff sounds. And these are caused by turbulent flow created by the blood cuff. The blood cuff, by tightening down your arm, is actually creating turbulent flow by creating a constriction within the blood vessels of your arm. And during the phase when the cuff is squeezing down your arm, it's creating a lot more pressure. They can listen for a first sound during this phase. That's the systolic phase. That's the phase when the heart is contracting. You have that first pressure from that first sound. And then when they release the cuff, it relaxes on your arm. They can then take the pressure during that phase, and that's the diastole, when the heart is relaxing. So if you've ever had blood pressure, taken, your doctor will give you two numbers. They will say your blood pressure is 120/80. That number, or that series of numbers, is the systole, is the first number they give, over the diastole. So it's the pressure that you have when the heart's contracting versus the pressure you have when the heart is relaxed. And next, going back to blood flow. Blood flow is the rate of flow in terms of mathematical representation. And this is the volume per unit of time at a certain point in a blood vessel. So volume is a three-dimensional trait. So we're looking at in a 3D space because blood is a fluid. It takes up a three-dimensional space, which is the blood vessel. Per some sort of unit of time, usually in minutes or seconds. and through a specific point, something like a blood vessel or an aorta. The example I give is 5 liters of blood per minute are passed through the aorta. So we have the volume per unit of time, is the rate, through a certain structure. And the blood flow itself is based on a couple of different variables. We have flow rate is equal to the difference in pressure from pressure 1, so that's the pressure at a point that we set, and pressure 2 is the second point we set for whatever structure we're looking at, divided by what is the resistance to flow. So resistance to flow is just the hindrance, the opposition to blood flowing through an object. Resistance, this R variable in the denominator of the formula, then breaks down into another formula. This is 128 VL divided by pi times d to the 4th power. I'm going to break those variables down. V is for viscosity. Viscosity is the measurement of resistance to flow for any sort of liquid. So when we say something has high viscosity, that means it has very high resistance to flow, whatever the fluid is itself. So something like water, for example, you could pour a glass of water really quickly because the water flows very smoothly. It has low viscosity. It's not resisting the flow. But if I were to tell you to pour a glass of peanut butter, that peanut butter is going to very, very slowly, if not at all, move out of the jar into whatever you're pouring it into. It has high viscosity. It's very resistant to flowing. So that's the V part of resistance formula. Then you have L, which is just the vessel length of whatever vessel we're looking at, the aorta, a vein, etc. And then R is the vessel radius, which technically it's not in the formula, but D is diameter. Diameter is just twice the radius. So resistance is based on viscosity, vessel length, and vessel radius. That all factors in to R. And then by substituting R with this formula here, we get Puiselli's law. And Puiselli's law basically says everything I just showed you, but all together now. So flow is equal to the difference in pressure divided by resistance. But we're now factoring in the actual terms that make up resistance, 128 VL over pi times d to the 4th. So we will be dividing R by that quantity, or dividing the difference in pressure by that quantity. And since we're dividing this numerator by a fraction, we'd flip and multiply. So that's why pi and d4 are in the numerator when in the formula they were in the denominator. So the big idea behind Puiselli's law is that flow is inversely related to resistance. So as you increase resistance through vasoconstriction, so you're tightening down those blood vessels, you're going to decrease flow. Mathematically, we know if we ever increase the denominator in a fraction, that's going to make it way bigger. So let's say the P1 minus P2 is equal to 1. And if we increase, and we have resistance equal to 1 in this case, 1 over 1 is 1. But if I increase resistance to 2, then that's 1/2. If I increase it to 3, it's 1/3, so on and so forth. So as we increase the denominator, flow rate is going to go down. And then the difference in pressure is going to be directly proportional to flow rate. So if we increase this, we increase the flow rate. If we decrease this, we decrease the flow rate. Next, we have the idea of critical closing pressure and Laplace's law. So critical closing pressure is the minimum amount of pressure we need for a blood vessel to actually maintain its structural integrity, to be able to stay open and allow blood to flow through. If we are below this critical closing pressure, the blood vessel will actually collapse on itself and not be able to function. It won't have its structural integrity. So we have to maintain some sort of pressure for the blood vessel. And there is a law called Laplace's law that factors this in. And the formula for that is force, or F, is equal to the blood vessel diameter D times P, which is the pressure of the blood vessel. So since there's no fraction bar here, both diameter and pressure are directly proportional to force. So, force is directly proportional to diameter and pressure. So if I increase pressure, we increase force. If I decrease pressure, we decrease force. If I increase pressure, yeah, we increase force, decrease pressure, decrease force. Same with diameter. So it's a 1-to-1. Then we have compliance. So your book describes it basically as when you increase blood volume, it will increase pressure and vice versa. It's not exactly the best way to explain it. The simplest way I like to talk about compliance is this idea of stretchiness in a blood vessel. How much can the blood vessel expand when you change the pressure? So the idea behind compliance is that you have to factor in how pressure changes and how the volume of the blood vessel changes, how much space is it allowing blood to occupy. So this formula we have here, compliance equals an increase in volume over an increase in pressure. Don't worry about too much about the formula itself, worry about the concepts surrounding compliance. What I mean by that is, if you have a blood vessel that is very compliant, it's very stretchy, it's able to expand a lot, that means if you have even a small increase in pressure, you're going to have a big increase in volume to accommodate that in order to fit more blood in that blood vessel. If you have a blood vessel that has not a lot of compliance, if you have an increase in pressure in the blood vessel, you're not going to have a really big increase in volume. The examples of this are your arteries. Your arteries have a very low compliance. So they have, even though we increase pressure in them because they have blood flowing from the heart, that's the major pump for the body, they're not increasing in volume very much. However, on the other hand, your veins act as a sort of blood reservoir, a blood storage. So even when we have increase in pressure in those veins, the veins themselves will increase to accommodate more blood with them. So we say those veins are very compliant. They're very stretchy. So arteries, not very compliant, not stretchy. Veins are compliant. They are very stretchy. Okay, so now we're going to talk more about the physiology with the systemic circulation. Again, this is circulation of the oxygenated blood to the tissues throughout the heart, or sorry, the tissues throughout the body, not the heart. We're bringing oxygenated blood from the heart to the tissues. Misspoke there for a second. Okay, so the first big concept we're going to talk about is how cross-sectional area alters with blood flow. So we have a diagram right here, sort of broken up into a part A, part B diagram. So we have the total cross-sectional area moving from the heart all the way back to the veins. And then we have the velocity of blood flow in milliliters per second going across from once the blood leaves the heart all the way back to the veins. So the idea is that as you move from the aorta to the arteries to the arterioles and then get to the capillaries, you are getting a lot more area. As you can see, the capillaries take a lot more space than just this single artery or just this single vein. And as you increase area for flow, you actually decrease velocity. We see this in this diagram right here. As we move from the heart, the blood's moving very, very quickly because there's a lot of, it's closer to the pump, which is the heart. So the blood's moving very quickly to the aorta and the arteries and the arterioles. But then when the space increases and we have a lot more opportunity for the blood to spread out and go through all those precapillary sphincters and through fair channels, the blood flow slows down a lot, but then picks back up when we decrease that area again and get back to the veins and the venules and back to the heart. So take home message, as you increase the cross-sectional area, which then will factor into the volume, you're going to increase, you're going to decrease velocity. Increasing flow decreases velocity. Increasing area flow. Then we have pressure and resistance. So another graph on the left here, we have pressure on our y-axis, and then we have the aorta, arteries, etc. on the x-axis. Again, think of this like distance from the heart. So pressure graphed against distance from the heart, because we're going aorta to the veins, the venous system. So regardless if we're talking about the systolic pressure when it's contracting or the diastolic pressure or the average, blood pressure is going to decrease as you move from the aorta to the veins. That's because we're moving further and further away from the actual pump of the body, that being the heart. The heart is going to be contracting very, very strongly to pump blood through the arteries to get all the way to the veins. The further we move away from the source, the less pressure we have. Then we have resistance factoring in here as well. So for resistance, it's not shown in the graph, but as you move from the aorta to the capillaries, you actually have increased resistance. And this is because moving from aorta to capillaries, you have a decrease in diameter for those blood vessels. As we saw from the formula a few slides back, as you have a decrease in diameter, that's going to factor into resistance from this formula, and then the resistance is going to drop. Then, as you move from the capillaries back to the venous system, which will again return to the heart, you're going to have an increase in diameter because those veins are more compliant. They can take up more space or stretch and have a larger diameter. That's going to decrease resistance. So as you move from the heart to the capillaries, resistance increases because of decreased diameter. As you move from the capillaries back to the veins, you're going to have a decrease in resistance because you have an increase in diameter. They are inversely related. So last thing I want to point out with this graph is this idea of pulse pressure. So pulse pressure is just the difference between the systolic pressure when the contraction is occurring versus the diastolic pressure when the heart is relaxed. So the difference between them is the pulse pressure. And pulse pressure, we know as the pulse you can take for an individual, such as when you check someone's pulse to see if they're living. That's where this comes from. Because we use pulse to determine what the heart rate is and what the rhythm is for the heart. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about capillary exchange within moving oxygenated blood into capillaries, moving deoxygenated blood out of capillaries. So the big idea behind capillary exchange is this idea of diffusion, moving from a high concentration of something to a low concentration of something through a gradient. And capillary exchange can be sort of manipulated, influenced by whatever the blood pressure is in the vessel, whatever the permeability or the ability for solutes and fluid to pass through the membrane, and then water. So the diffusion of water is always going to play a factor as well. And for capillary exchange, the big mathematical concept we're looking at here is what's called net filtration pressure. And this is just the force that establishes the gradient moving the fluid across the capillary walls, the fluid in this case being largely blood and some plasma. And net filtration pressure, or NFP, is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. So hydrostatic pressure is just the pressure of the blood and the blood cells on the vessels. And then osmotic pressure is basically just the pressure of the plasma and any other tissue fluid, which is primarily water, but there's some other solids there as well. So hydrostatic pressure, pressure of blood; osmotic pressure, pressure of plasma and tissue fluid. So if we subtract osmotic from hydrostatic, we get the net filtration pressure. And that comes into play with getting materials in to the capillaries and getting materials out of the capillaries. So at the arterial end, when we're going from arteries to the arterioles to be diffused into the capillaries, we're going to have a much more pressure on the hydrostatic side than we are on the osmotic side. So the pressure that the actual blood has on the blood vessel is much higher than the pressure of any sort of solids or extracellular fluid or plasma has on the blood vessel. Because of this, we're going to have higher amount of hydrostatic pressure, like I said, than the osmotic. And to find the net filtration pressure, which will tell us the direction that the blood's going to flow, we're going to subtract one from the other. And when we have a positive net filtration pressure, in this case 13 millimeters of mercury, we're going to have a net diffusion of blood into the capillaries. Then some of that blood will go off to the lymphatic system, which we'll talk about in a future PowerPoint. But most of that volume of blood is going to want to go back into the venous end of the capillary, so it can go back to the veins and stay in circulation. When this happens, you then have a much higher net osmotic pressure than you do of the hydrostatic pressure. So in this case, we have 13 millimeters of mercury for hydrostatic and 20 millimeters of mercury for osmotic. So when we subtract the osmotic from the hydrostatic, we actually get a negative number for the net filtration pressure. And when the net filtration pressure is negative, the blood is going to want to move from the capillary back into the veins, the venous end of the capillary. Okay. So last piece of information for this section of the presentation is characteristics of veins once now we're talking about blood that's gone through the capillaries, through the arteries already, and into the veins. So we call any blood that goes into the veins, because it's returning to the heart, the venous return. It's pretty self-explanatory. And this is going to be based on a couple things. So if we have an increase in blood volume, we're going to have an increase in the amount of blood or venous return that's coming to the heart. If we have an increase in what's called venous tone, that's going to have an increase in venous return to the heart. Venous tone is basically that your nervous system is continually stimulating the veins to partially contract. Think of it kind of like a muscle tone when you learned about muscles in 157. You learned about your muscles being innervated and constantly receiving sympathetic stimulation from the brain to maintain their general shape. They need that stimulation. Same idea with venous tone. You have continual stimulation from the sympathetic nervous system to maintain that contraction, maintain some sort of structural integrity. And then the last thing that will increase the amount of blood that's returned to the heart through the veins is through arterial dilation and vein compression. So the arteries relaxing and the veins, not the arteries relaxing, the arteries expanding their diameter a little bit and the veins decreasing their diameter a little bit. That occurs during strenuous activity, such as exercise, in order to get more blood back to the heart.